This week, for our visit to a national park, it's going to be back in the old part of the country. And I'm going to be doing so because it exemplifies some of the newest thinking of its time. I'm talking about the Marsh, Billings, Rockefeller National Historic Park in Woodstock, Vermont. It sits in the upper valley of the Quechee River, and it's far enough off the beaten tracks, even in 2026, that it's still a little hard to get to, and it looks like a Currier and Ives version of Vermont. I mean, a little too perfect, clapboard farmhouses, dark green mountains coming down to the water, and land that has been worked for centuries to feed the countryside around it. The park centers on a 555-acre farm that was operating as an active, productive farm when the National Park Service took it over. And unlike the mega single-item farms that comprise most of the country's agricultural productivity, this farm still covers a wide range of agricultural production. Produce, poultry, dairy, even the production of wood products. The house itself is a grand Gilded Age mansion, so it fits in perfectly with this time period, but it also makes clear that most of the people interested in innovative farming were doing it for play, not work. Innovation was, and often is, too scary or risky for people who mostly think about, will I have the food I need tomorrow? Frederick Billings was a railroad baron and art collector, but he was also interested in bringing the scientific-facing organizing principles to agriculture that were all the rage as industrialization was weaving itself into the American way of life. The Billings farm was one of the first scientific model farms in the United States. In the late 1800s, when for most Americans the level of new and different they wanted to bring to their farm was a new plow design, Frederick Billings and his land manager were experimenting with mechanized farming equipment, crop rotation, and improved breeding of livestock, as well as record keeping that tracked yields and efficiency with precision. Your average farmer, many of them were recent immigrants, they were just following along with what they had learned at home, or if they were new to the game, and many were at this time period, they were simply trying out what the farm next door was doing. Billings had given his land manager direction and support to think beyond traditional farming. Rather, they should try a new way. Iron machines and systemic experimentation were the new hot thing. And since he wasn't going to starve if it didn't work, he was willing to try everything new, as well as invent new approaches to organizing farm labor and construction along the way. The barn, while beautiful, looks quite a bit different from what you'd imagine under the word barn. And these differences tell the story of how they were thinking. This was an era when people were thinking deep thoughts about ventilation and airflow, as they designed new-style fireplaces, iron furnaces, gas lighting, and fireboxes in iron freestanding stoves. So the barn had some novel ventilation, planned spaces for different animals, and came up with semi-mechanical systems for handling feed and manure. Workers no longer had to bring the feed to animals by barrow and muck out their stalls in the same way. It made moving and processing the animal manure into compost for soil enrichment much easier. And this is where cutting-edge agricultural machinery was tested. And you can go visit the property now and tour working gardens, orchards, and interpretive stations that explain the shift from subsistence farming to managed, mechanized agriculture. The farm is still operational, and you can see animals walk the pastures and see the early stages of bringing industrial thinking to food production. So if you find yourself in central Vermont, a nice place to be in the sticky summer weather of New England, head to Woodstock and spend a few hours at the Marsh, Billings, Rockefeller farm. It will give you a grounded picture of how iron and machinery actually transformed American farming in the 19th century. Episode 171, Iron has New Jobs in Food. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the moment when iron stopped being primarily a material for cooking on and became the thing that made America go fast. We're talking about railroads and canned food and factory-made machine parts and the gear wheel, and what all of it meant for how people ate and how much time they suddenly had to think about things other than making food. To find out what that means, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that up until this moment in American history, when it came to how iron affected food, iron was for cooking on grates, on griddles, on spits, on pans, and in cauldrons. When iron first came into human lives, most of it went into weapons, but its second big job was its role as cooking vessels. It took a few hundred years for swords to get beat into actual metal plowshares. The metal scythe, which is essentially a large knife for cutting down grain, came way first. Getting to the point where people thought of using iron to open dirt for better farming took a while longer. Interestingly, using iron to make better ways of cooking things, like iron fireboxes and then stoves, that lives in the same era as the metal plow. These things arrived more or less together. But now iron has some new jobs, and those new jobs basically came down to making everything go faster. Now, as someone who has read her share of sci-fi and has done so since Choose Your Own Adventure books, I am sure you are not surprised to find out I am a fan of the Andy Weir Science-averse. In this case, Hail Mary is the relevant book for a passage I pretty much skimmed right over the first time I read it back in the day, but it jumped out and grabbed me when I reread it recently. Ava Strott, the project manager of Adamantine Will, is talking to our hero, Dr. Ryland Grace. As they're discussing the problem of the reduction in solar radiation, she points out just how hard it is going to go. Largely because working hard for food and food shortages, fundamental problems at the most base level, don't even cross our modern minds. The way she puts it, people nowadays, they have no idea how good they have it. The past was unrelenting misery for most people. And the further back in time you go, the worse it was. For 50,000 years, right up to the Industrial Revolution, human civilization was about one thing, and one thing only: food. Every culture that existed put most of their time, energy, manpower, and resources into food. Hunting it, gathering it, farming it, ranching it, storing it, distributing it, it was all about food. Even the Roman Empire. Everyone knows about the emperors, the armies, and the conquests, but what the Romans really invented was a very efficient system of acquiring farmland and transportation of food and water. The Industrial Revolution mechanized agriculture. Since then, we've been able to focus our energies on other things. But that's only been the last 200 years. Before that, most people spent most of their lives directly dealing with food production. She's right. In the timeline we are on, we are at the part where mechanized agriculture, mechanized food processing, and mechanized food storage all begins. And all of it rests on the new deployment of iron. We're about to enter the stretch of the show where the pace picks up considerably. It used to be a major technology jump came through a few times a century, or maybe once a decade. Cross-cut saws, charcoal kilns, vacuum boiling to speed up salt production. But now there are major technological advances that are going to change everything multiple times a decade. And as I'm sure you can sympathize, many people feel overwhelmed. So where did all of this start? If I go all the way back, it is to realize that the first type of accumulated wealth that really created a ruling class with any significant leisure time was grain. It was a source of carbohydrates that could be produced predictably and stored for an entire year or longer. This made it possible to create a food cycle where people did not have to experience a part of the year where they would be predictably starving. Rice, corn, wheat, barley, and such were all things that could be easily produced far from the place they were consumed. They store well, and they can be consumed far away in time from when they were made. In the right climate and conditions, even over a year after the harvest. This allowed for stockpiling in the event of a bad harvest. And there are very few other foodstuffs, before modern preservation techniques, that could say the same. Because of the almost constant perishability of most food and the fact that growing it, gathering it, preserving it, and preparing it take up so much time and energy, at any given time, almost everybody in a society was spending most of their lives producing food. Activities outside of hunting, gathering, or farming, and then storing and turning raw ingredients into actual meals, that took up nearly every spare moment. Whatever time was left with what energy you had, that went into making and repairing homes, creating garments, building tools, which meant there was very little time left for inventing new things or for reconsidering how you were looking at the world. For most people, life was entirely about making food for themselves and, depending on the system they found themselves in, possibly for other people too. Some peasants were living more or less adequately, contributing a manageable portion of their labor to a ruling class and keeping the rest. Some were more or less crushed under the wheel of their local arrangement, and a large number of people across human history were producing food and providing labor as enslaved people, with nothing to call their own. The societies built on that foundation did leave behind some remarkable structures, but the misery eventually would breed their downfall. Anyway, in the age before any metal in farming, there was a pretty hard limit as to how much extra food a person or a farming community could produce. Iron moved that limit. Slowly at first. The metal scythe, the metal-tipped plow, better axes for clearing land, trains for bringing a workforce to where you needed it, along with supplies. And then, in the stretch of time we're entering, those changes stopped being so slow. They started moving at a quick clickety-clack, the pace of the train on its tracks. So now we are entering the factory portion of the program. Iron doesn't just move food or prepare the ground for food or process food. It also starts to make the machines that make the things that do the plowing and the processing and the moving. We are leaving the handmade era. Along with railroads and steam engines and iron stoves, the gear wheel is also getting stamped out in metal. And I need to talk about gears here for a while because it is truly one of the great underappreciated objects in human history. And when I say gear, I mean the circles with regularly spaced teeth along their outside edge. Now, gears have been with us since at least the 500s BCE, though probably longer since they appear to have been just around in the Zhou dynasty rather than being announced as a new marvel. For most of human history, gears lived in two places, in clocks and in mechanical toys for the wealthy. Water clocks, orreries to track the stars, and some in rather remarkable devices like the south-facing chariot, which was exactly what it sounds like. It was a contraption that used differential gears to keep a figure always pointing south, no matter which direction the cart was going as it was pulled around China. In later years, gears found their way into water wheels and windmills, objects of grand and expensive public works. But in the larger world, they were few and rare, and this was mainly because each and every one was made by hand, a single object produced by a single craftsperson. Much of the early circle geometry that mathematicians worked out, the even division of circles and the relationships between a radius and a circumference, was developed in part because people were trying to figure out exactly this problem. How do you make a gear with evenly spaced teeth? Basically, a gear and its ability to transfer power from one place to another, to concentrate it or distribute it, was understood by only a handful of people. And it was hard to deploy. When you're working with hand tools on materials that need to be strong enough to bear the repetitive mechanical stress a gear needs to withstand, and you're measuring more or less by eye rather than with calipers or a reliable ruler, well, multiple tries were usually required, and as a result, for centuries, geared mechanisms simply only showed up in rich people's diversions or in massive civil engineering projects where the cost was covered by its overall usefulness. Until we get to the machine age. With the arrival of the metal plow and early steam engines, more people had more time to think about machines. Coal mining became more efficient, so there was more light at night, and more iron could be mined and smelted and turned into stronger alloys. The arrival of 19th century metallurgy and the dropping price of steel and other iron alloys meant that the world suddenly had a new material you could try to build things out of. And this was the age of the Eiffel Tower, the iron frame of the Statue of Liberty, and the Brooklyn Bridge. Yes, the underwater engineering gets most of the press, and the stone towers are visually striking. But it is the metallurgy in the crossbeams of the bridge deck, in the wires and the cables, combined with a manufacturing capacity that made those beams and girders and fasteners and railings and long, long runs of spun cable possible. That was the true technological marvel of the structure. Hundreds of tons of steel, which was still a product in furious development, went into the Brooklyn Bridge. During its construction, there were constant arguments about what kind of steel to use. Many advocated for crucible steel, that is, iron and other components mixed in a very large, very heat-resistant vat, that is, a crucible, a method that has been in use in different ways for around 3,000 years. The other option was the Bessemer process. This is a version of how modern steel is made, and it was viewed with some suspicion because at that time it had only been around for a few decades. The Bessemer process uses forced air to allow better mixing of carbon and other elements into the iron. It was demonstrated to routinely produce a more dependable product, but because it was not well understood by many people, it was considered chancy. In the end, the science won out, and eventually, in 1883, it became another example of how the new jobs iron was taking on transformed an all-day ordeal, crossing the East River from Manhattan to Brooklyn, into something that could be done in a matter of hours. Iron and its child steel were making it possible for America to go fast. Now, trains get all the press, and it's very easy to take a dramatic picture of a train. Most people can look at a locomotive and get a vague idea of how it works, and they can definitely get an idea of what it does for them. But many of the mechanical devices that were changing the world behind the scenes did not fall into this category at all. They were changing everything, but there weren't that many people who could have explained how. One of the most important up-and-coming new machines was the combine harvester. The same wide, flat fields that had encouraged steel plow innovation invited other horse-drawn machines. Combine harvesters required a large team, up to 20 horses or mules, to pull it. This was a significant investment in owning or renting horseflesh, but it could cut grain in a field while also threshing it, that is, removing the grain from the stalk and its hard outer casing, as well as winnowing it, blowing off the chaff, the parts of the stalk that aren't the wheat grain itself. Suddenly, there was one machine that could do 3 arduous jobs that had been done by hand, and it was all completed in hours instead of over the course of days. The first patent of one of these machines in America was issued to Hiram Moore in Michigan. But no mechanical combines of any practical usefulness were really available until the 1850s. The increased iron and steel production capacity of the United States after the Civil War, coupled with the flood of workers, especially the formerly enslaved from southern states participating in the Great Migration, meant that there was a jump in production capacity. Machines that compressed such difficult tasks so noticeably were a popular item to invest in. And I promise, I will look into the excitement around labor-saving devices as suddenly American farmers have to start really paying for labor, at least something. Oh yeah, and that thing where their workers can leave. The innovation in farm equipment was driven by more than just the availability of materials. And it wasn't just the combine. Seed drills were also a popular and common object coming out of the blacksmith shop. With a switch from the harrow, look way back in the 17th century, to a plow, the planting of a grain had evolved from hand scattering seeds from a basket. The medieval harrow, which was basically a comb for the ground, it scratches the soil to open it up a bit. Very different action from the modern rotary or disc harrows, which smooth soil after it's been opened up by the plow. Anyway, on freshly plowed land, it was wasteful to hand broadcast seeds. Birds got a lot of them, and others were parched by the sun. Some were too close together, and others were too far apart. It made more sense just to plant them in rows, and often in a bit of a mound, depending on the plant. And all of this correct placement and spacing required a great deal of stooping and mounding and poking. A seed drill would reduce the bending and stooping considerably. It could even deposit more than one seed at a time and space them properly between rows and even cover them up. Versions of seed drills or planting tubes had popped up independently in agriculture in places as distantly distributed as Sumeria and China. But a useful, mechanized, multi-row version was conceived and executed by one Jethro Tull in the mid-1700s in England. Now, it didn't catch on immediately. It was a fussy and somewhat complex machine to manufacture, especially when made of all individually handmade parts. But it did plant a seed, that multiple people would tinker with until better materials and better manufacturing capability made seed drills worth the trouble. By the 1860s, as harvesting combines started to spread, so did seed drills, as well as hand-cranked threshing and winnowing machines. The amount of wheat or corn or barley or soybeans or flax or oats a family farm could plow for, plant, and then bring in increased markedly. Now, most people didn't own all of these items outright. Rather, they paid for a share of time on a machine owned collectively or on one owned by a neighbor. They were able to plant more acreage in less time with less seed. Seed drills reduced seed waste considerably. And with mechanical harvesting, or even just mechanical threshing and winnowing, they were able to bring in a larger harvest with the same workforce. As a result, there wasn't just more grain for people, there was also more grain for livestock. This meant more cows and pigs and chickens to eat. More flour meant bread was less expensive and there was more of it. This is the age when breadcrumbs become waste rather than a precious ingredient to be saved at every turn for sauces or stuffing. Flour becomes an ingredient in things other than breads. The roux is born, and middle-class people begin to deep fat fry batter-dipped items. And all of this is arriving alongside the age of mechanical farming. So yes, food production was definitely affected by the new jobs that iron had. But what sped up production even further was the factory manufacture of machine parts themselves. A perfect illustration of this is clocks. The earliest clocks were large, individually constructed works of art that graced town squares or the palaces, mansions, and villas of the powerful and the wealthy. Purchasing a clock for a town was a major event. These clocks were so valuable that they would even sometimes be stolen in the midst of war and reinstalled elsewhere as prizes. However, by the late 1800s, clocks had not only shrunk to tabletop size, they were inexpensive enough that they could be provided to or even purchased by household servants to help them start their duties on time. This was not only because metal had become more plentiful and therefore cheaper, it was also because clock parts were being rolled out and stamped by machines. Hand-finished and assembled by humans, yes, but the individual hand manufacture of every last part was a thing of the past, at least for common clocks. The same thing was happening for the internal workings of all manner of other machines. Sure, the machine that cut a gear to the correct size and tooth count still had to be set up by hand and might be cranked by hand or hooked up to a drive powered by a water wheel if you were fancy. But gears and other machine parts, these could be produced repeatedly to the same specifications and in minutes rather than hours. And changing to another size was the result of moving about a few dials, not doing a series of hand calculation and arduous measurements. The resulting parts could then be assembled in machines that would go on to manufacture forks or cigarettes or parts for your harvest combine or a thread winder or mechanical weaver or flour mill, or to create a machine that would pound blades for butcher's cleavers or saw blades for cutting down timber. Now that the parts to make machines were suddenly so much easier to produce, you could invent all sorts of machines. Iron was about to make humans in the United States go faster. Canned food was the first new way of preserving food to come along in about a millennia. And the railroad, the engine, the cars, the rails, these were all making travel happen in ways that were basically magic just a few years before. So there was this way of trapping the effort of preparing food in a way that made it stable for transport. Suddenly, we had the ability to eat far away, in both distance and time, from where the food was made. And that would alter the way people planned their lives. It would start out small, but once it caught on and everyone created their own shortcuts, the bottom line was how we eat and how much time we think things should take would never be the same again. I mean, think about what it actually meant to prepare chicken soup before any of this. You had to begin with a live chicken covered in feathers. You had to go from there to a plucked and clean bird to one that was all broken down and cooked in a soup. And this all had to be done in a household where your only access to water was a well that produced it, one hand-drawn bucket at a time, or maybe from the river. Now, if you were fancy, you might get it from a pump out in the yard. But now, you could get an entire whole cooked chicken in a can. That canned chicken or canned fish or canned oysters or canned lobsters, these were literally fast food. The time from starting to make a meal to sitting down to eat it was shorter in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few decades before. Not only that, the ingredients one had access to changed drastically by virtue of the new roles iron was playing. And what this meant is that people suddenly had time to think and time to tinker and time to talk about their ideas and try them out. And this would lead to even more innovations. And many of those innovations came from people asking a single question. How can I make it easier and faster to do these time-consuming, repetitive tasks? Iron was making all manner of ways for things to go faster, and most of the United States was there for it. They wanted to go fast. And next week, it's time to look at the history of the potato, the savory potato, the potato that was called the Irish potato in America, but it wasn't Irish in any way at all. I mean, when people think of American food, even ourselves, a common phrase was meat and potatoes. And that phrase comes from this period of time. Join me to find out just how that happened. And as always, there's way more to it than you think. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And if this episode got you thinking or brought up questions, I'd love to talk about it. And please leave a review, tell a friend, and keep downloading. It genuinely helps me to know that you're out there. A special mention for this episode for the book Cuisine and Empire by Rachel Loudon for some excellent insights. And as always, music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.